Are white people naturally racist? Are straight men naturally oppressive? Is forced DEI training actually unfair or immoral? How has the education system changed in the last decade or so? And do we even need college anymore? And how have the politics of the last year shaped modern Christianity? And vice versa, how can Christians, in return, help shape the public square? We're going to be talking about all of this and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. We are excited to be talking with our special guest, but before I get to him, I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Executive Director for Theology by the Pint, which is the organization out of which Theology on Air, this podcast, came. Joined, as usual, by Evan McClanahan, pastor here at First Lutheran in Midtown. And if you are curious about our events that we do here in Houston, where we drink craft beer and talk about all kinds of juicy, fascinating things, or if you want to support us or just learn more about who we are, you can go to theologybythepint.org and find out everything. We are fully funded by donations. So of course we are always encouraged when you decide to sponsor, even just a little bit helps us. But we are going to be talking with Dr. Owen Anderson today. Dr. Anderson is a professor of philosophy at Arizona State University. He's also a pastor. He's a Princeton and Oxford speaker, father of 4, and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu instructor. So he has a lot of free time, I guess, with a unique blend of pastoral wisdom, academic expertise, and real-world experience. He makes complex ideas accessible and engaging for listeners. He's also currently involved in a lawsuit in Arizona over DEI training. So we are going to get spicy today. I'm excited about it. Welcome, Dr. Anderson. Thanks for coming.
Sarah, Evan, it's really nice to be here with you. I'm looking forward to talking.
Yeah. So I said many spicy things just in your bio alone. First, before we get to all the DEI stuff, you're a pastor, you're a professor, you're a dad. Give us, our people don't know who you are. Tell us about you. Tell us about your story, maybe how you became a believer and how you got to be a pastor and a professor. That's wild.
So I was raised sort of in the evangelical background, going to Bible churches, non-denominational Bible churches, and doing things like Awana, which is, really good at getting you into memorizing scripture. But I think if you saw me as a kid in Awana, you'd think that guy's not going to make it, because I was always trying to find what's a quick verse I can memorize so I can get the next thing, the next badge or whatever it was. And so I had a lot of good input, though, being raised by Christian parents, took me to church, taught me the gospel. And in high school, I kind of went through the natural questioning time where you start to wonder, how do I know this stuff is true? I had friends who were Mormons or atheists, and I wondered, well, they believe what they believe because their parents told them. Mm-hmm. And I believe what I believe because my parents told me. And so that's when I started sort of getting into philosophy. And thankfully, I had a really good youth pastor who directed me into those things. He gave me books to read by Lewis or others to sort of answer some of my questions. And then I found out that you can actually get a job doing that. I didn't know about that. It blew my mind. It's called philosopher. And so I said, well, sign me up. That's what I want to do. So I pursued philosophy degrees and ended up also doing degrees in history and religious studies, just because I saw the overlap there. And I didn't want to be limited to current analytic philosophy. I wanted to do religious studies as well, to explore the philosophy of religion. Yeah. And so in that process, I had a professor who was Reformed, and he handed me, after class one day, the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And I had never heard of that growing up, even though I was confirmed in a PCUSA church. And actually, people might say, well, that's why you never heard about it. Oh, yes. So that got me into thinking about it. And I happened to read a book by James White around that same time.
Hey, he's done several debates here.
Okay, yeah, probably. I mean, that's his thing. I think he's coming up on his 300th public debate. So, 200. But his book was about.
I want to have his 200th debate here, but I got some things in the cooker. Go ahead.
Good.
Which book was that?
Well, invite me. I'd like to come out too.
Okay.
It was Letters to a Mormon Elder. Mm-hmm. So it's probably a book even Arminians would enjoy as well, because it is about apologetics to Mormonism. But in there, he did make a comment. It wasn't the purpose of the chapter. It wasn't the purpose of the book, but he made a comment about predestination. And I just thought, well, that's obviously false. And I remember talking to my youth pastor about that and said, well, clearly, if we're predestined, we don't have free will, and none of the rest of the gospel makes sense. So he walked me through, well, not necessarily. Interestingly, he had gone to Grand Canyon University at the same time as James White. So back then, Grand Canyon was a university of like 300 students. Now it's like, competing with Liberty to be the largest Christian university. But so I think James White was ahead of him, but they knew each other. So that kind of stuff started getting me into Reformed thought, and I began attending Reformed churches. Now, fast forward, I went ahead and got my degrees in philosophy, got offered a job, which is rare. I was sort of gambling that I would, I mean, not really because I'm Reformed, but gambling like for every philosophy job, there's 300 applicants for every one position.
Yeah.
And so, just if you're thinking about a career, that's just not really doable. But I got offered a tenure track job at Arizona State University. And so that'd be great. I'll take it. And tenure track means it's focused on research. So I do teach some, but I also am required to do research and publish, which is also what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to do both of those things. So that's my career started that way. I've been granted tenure, and then the next step after tenure is called being a full professor, where you just say Professor Anderson, not assistant professor or associate professor. But then my current church I'm at, how I became a pastor was I worked with some others to plant a church in North Phoenix 4 years ago.
What's the denomination of the church?
Well, we actually were working with on a Reformed Episcopalian friend.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And so he's here. I worked with him, worked with his bishop, and they helped us plant this church. But we're really Presbyterian in our leaning. So right now we're in the process of joining the RPCNA, the Reformed Presbyterians, which is best known as the Psalm Singers because we're exclusive psalmists.
Oh, wow. Man. Okay. So you were at that church and they needed some help and said, will you be our pastor? I mean, are you the...
Yeah, well, this is an area where of Phoenix where they need a Reformed church. And we were also convicted of certain things like exclusive psalmody and holding the Westminster Confession. And so we planted our congregation originally with the Reformed Episcopalians, or not our denomination, our congregation. And then we said to them, though, from the beginning, we're probably going to look to join a Presbyterian denomination.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're in the process of doing right now.
I mean, I just have to ask, how do you divvy up your time? You're a dad of 4, you're doing jujitsu, you're teaching classes, you're researching, and you're being a pastor. That's crazy.
I have to be careful, right? Because family comes first. So my wife and my 4 kids are top priority. And so I have to make sure that my schedule doesn't ease them out of things. Yeah. And so I'm very protective of my family time. But otherwise, these are things that I really enjoy. And I believe that they're important to do. So they're not draining necessarily, where you just feel exhausted afterwards. You're not excited about it. I mean, I get tired. I got to rest, but I'm excited to do each of these things.
But they energize you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, maybe that's our segue then into, they may energize you and you love what you do, but recently, and I say recently, but it's been over a year now, right? That you've been in a tussle with Arizona State University, so much so that you made the news. Tell us a little bit about this lawsuit and DEI mess. Tell us all about that.
Yeah, well, the big story is just that ASU is currently the largest state university in the country. We have something like, I see different numbers. I see like 150, 160, 170 between our campus and online presence. So we're just huge, and that's our goal. Our president wants us to become this massive scaled American university. But what you'll notice is that especially our humanities classes, but not limited to those, they're controlled by the radical leftist ideology. And this is something new that I've seen happening during my career, maybe starting about 15 years ago to the present, because when I went to State University and your professors were generally atheists. I had maybe 2 or 3 Christian professors, and you knew that, but it also wasn't really the topic of the class.
Right.
So you're just
wasn't particularly relevant.
Yeah. Whereas now the students are just hammered with this ideology. And the degrees actually say we're training you to be an advocate for this. So you're basically going to missionary school for John Money's gender philosophy.
Oh, gosh.
You're supposed to go out there and spread it. So I started seeing this happening, and I said, wait, I'm not going to participate in that. In fact, that's wrong.
Yeah.
And so I began calling attention to it. And one of the first ways that it came up was that I was told by our school director, we're going to decolonize all of our curriculum.
Oh, you got to do that, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah,
You got to
really
decolonize.
Especially
but what
Shakespeare.
decolonization is a philosophy. It's a Marxist philosophy.
Yeah.
And so it'll be sold to the public or the student as, well, the modern world had a lot of abuses. Colonial powers did a lot of wrong things, right? And you say, yeah, that's true. So we need to decolonize. But well, that's a whole package of Marxism, which if anything, competed to beat the modern world, the colonial powers in their excesses and abuses. So while we want to
imagine just imagine the boats off in the ocean, but the flag they're on their mast is the Marxist flag, and they're just the new colonialists moving in because they have a point of view, they have a worldview too that they intend to implement. So
well, that's exactly right. So I said I'm not doing that and started drawing attention to it, and then about a year later, some students were going to have an event with Charlie Kirk, Dennis Prager, Robert Kiyosaki. And it was going to be at the Honors College at ASU. And the honors professors wrote a letter. It was 37 out of 40 of them, so the vast majority. And they said, those guys are white supremacists and should not be allowed to speak here. And they won. They weren't allowed to speak at the Honors College. They found another room at the university, but they successfully kept them and those ideas from being spoken of at the university. Now, if you know Dennis Prager, white supremacist, right? Robert Kiyosaki, Japanese American.
Is he the rich dad, poor dad guy?
Yep, precisely. Yeah. So it's just the ridiculous claim, but it's the go-to insult that terrifies everyone. Oh, I would hate to be called that. And so I'll just toe the line because otherwise they'll threaten me with being called a white supremacist. And my colleagues have since done that to me left and right. It's just what they will do. That's their go-to. But I spoke up about that, objected to it, was on Dennis Prager's show a few times. I asked him, hey, what's it like to be a white supremacist? He said, yeah, I've been accused of being a Zionist, but never a white supremacist. That's the other side of the whole thing. So that kind of got me talking to people, talking to state legislators. And then around that same time, I received an email. It was sent to all ASU employees. You need to take this employee training. And we have a handful of things. We have to take internet security training, fire training, sexual harassment reporting training. Just, you work at a corporation. That's what they do. So I started looking into this one, and it was just DEI training. It was called Inclusive Communities, but it has a module called DEI.
Okay.
That's one of the ways ASU tried to get out of it. They said, it's not DEI training, it's Inclusive Communities with this module called DEI. Yeah. So I screen recorded it all, took screenshots, and said, this isn't right. It has content in here about how you need to believe the United States is a white supremacist nation. You need to believe that the main problem facing us is something called whiteness or heteronormativity. And I don't believe those are the main problems facing us, especially the way they define those things. And so this can't be required of everybody. So that's the context in which Goldwater Institute, which is a well-known legal defense group. They're like ADF, except for ADF usually does religious First Amendment. Goldwater does more libertarian government overreach cases. And so Goldwater said, yeah, this is actually a violation of Arizona law. And I said, let's go to court then. We need to get rid of this. So that's, like you said, that's been a year. And it's been fun to see how ASU responds, because their spokesman came out right away and said, this doesn't exist. We don't know what Professor Anderson is talking about. Well, I took screenshots, right? That's not a good approach. And so then they followed up and said, well, it's not DEI though. Again, screenshots, guys. Yeah. And so then they kept trying to kind of downplay it. But each time, either Goldwater or I could just put up the transcript and say, well, here it is. You're saying heteronormativity is the problem, and people have to accept your sexual philosophy, which means reject Christianity. And you can't do that as a state university. So the next step, the actual legal defense they took, was to say Anderson doesn't have standing. The law they're citing doesn't provide individual employees to bring this kind of case. So that went before a judge. Now, I should tell you, ASU hired Perkins Coie. Now, if you know anything about law firms, this is the major leftist law firm, a national law firm. They're the ones involved in the Hillary Clinton Russia dossier.
Yeah. So, wow.
Yeah, I mean,
Mark Elias was there, all the electioneering, and they just lost their security clearance. That's one of the.
Yeah, well, I think they had to get, it's like temporarily reinstated though because of a judge. But I mean, that's the level we're dealing with.
Good grief.
Largest state university hires Perkins Coie to defend its DEI employee training. And so we made our case. They made their case. A judge in January said, of course he has standing. That's the purpose of the law. We had an amicus brief from the senator and the state representative here in Arizona who wrote the law. And they said, yes, of course he has standing.
Oh my gosh.
What we intended this for.
Let me clarify something.
Yeah.
You were suing what were you suing them for? Or you were suing them so that they would not enforce, or they wouldn't force the faculty to take this DEI training.
Yeah, I'm not getting any money. The case is not about money. There's no money on the table.
So you were just trying to take that learning module off the table, and that
you can't require DEI training. Yeah.
Okay. And they were fighting that vociferously. Wow.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It's amazing because of that, right? They didn't say something like, well, and I don't want to give them strategies.
I doubt they're listening to Theology on Air, but hey,
I'm thinking about it like, if I was them, my main concern would be to get this out of the news. Right. My second concern would be to save money. And so the modules were made by another company that ASU then used. I would have just said, yeah, we had this other company do it. You're right. We're not happy with the quality of what they did. We're going to revamp this with our own ASU stuff. Case closed. It's all over. And you look good as if you were responding to stuff.
Yeah.
Instead, they just double down. Even now, after the executive orders, when ASU's been scrubbing its web pages of DEI,
oh boy,
it's still going.
That's crazy. The inclusive community.
Yeah, the case they appealed, so they lost, and the judge said you can go to court. So we haven't even gotten to the case yet. We just cleared away the claim that I don't have standing.
Right.
And why it's great when we go to court is we'll be able to put the administrators under oath, meaning a spokesman can say whatever they want to the newspaper. There's no really legal liability there. They can say it doesn't exist. An administrator under oath can't say that. And so that is the worst case scenario for ASU. So they paused that by appealing the decision. So now we're at the appellate court.
Good grief.
And we presented our case, and we'll see what the appellate court does. I suppose that both sides, whoever loses that, will appeal it to the Arizona Supreme Court, which is better for all of us because then it'll have the strength of an Arizona Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
And hopefully all the way to the Supreme Court, and they'll rule in your favor.
I don't know if it can because it's about an Arizona law.
Oh, okay.
That would be great. But
at least your state would be covered, assuming that you win. Two questions, or just one comment. Perkins Coie probably bills $1,000 an hour or something like that. So I mean, it's a huge financial commitment to involve them, or any law firm like that. But it's kind of a cliche in more conservative circles to basically say that the left, by and large, or leftism, is a quasi-religion, complete with creeds, ethical conduct, penalties, etc. Do you think that's why they're doubling down? I mean, is that? Do you agree with that? Again, it's kind of a cliche, but
as a religious studies scholar, one of the things I studied was what is religion, and so I've made the exact case you're mentioning, Evan, of saying this fits a religious cult, the definition of a religious cult, and so I think that's 100% right. But there's a mixed bag though, because there are administrators who just want to make ASU the biggest university in the country. And so they're not necessarily committed to DEI. And that's why I'm thinking that kind of an administrator should have just taken the approach I just said. But what tells us those aren't the ones in charge is the approach they're taking. They're going to defend this in court at $1,000, $1,500 an hour, even when they've lost the national debate. And that's one of the messages I want to tell students and parents. The executive orders didn't change anything. No professor said, you know what? Trump's right. We've been racist this whole time. We've been discriminating. We need to stop. All they said was, we're going to scrub those words.
Yeah.
Right.
We'll keep the meaning and we'll use different words.
Yeah.
And so I have a Substack, which I dedicate to just kind of following this stuff. Dr. Owen Anderson on Substack, just documenting here it still is at ASU's web pages. You still see the same ideas. Yeah. They're avoiding maybe they think the federal government might just do a quick search and they say, okay, there's no DEI words. So
no word equity in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a similar, you mentioned Charlie Kirk. There was a mom from Illinois, Deerfield, whose daughter was uncomfortable. This is a story that came up last week. She went to the school board and said, adults watched my daughter undress because they had to have a boy in the locker room. Anyway, people can Google those words and find that story. But the mom kept saying, Trump said this is can't happen anymore at schools. You're violent. And I'm like, no, that isn't what he said. He said you'll lose federal funding.
Yeah.
But I don't know that there's, I mean, I think what they did violates many privacy laws, making adults watch girls undress. I think that's like super illegal. But it
just seems like it should be, right? Like,
yes,
you would think
common
so.
sense.
But there is this secondary thing that needs to happen now, where if we don't want these things happening, we're like, the DOJ needs to go in and like start, or the Department of Education, like money needs to be withdrawn, lawsuits need to be filed. It's time to like, I hate to use this cliche, but fight fire with fire. I mean, it's time to get serious and say, because this is an ideological war. These are two incompatible points of view. The DEI is not a kind of policy. It's a worldview. It's a cult. Yeah. In many respects, they have points of view, and either their side is right or our side is right. But they can't. I'm sorry, they cannot coexist. So I think we're like at the front edge, and and I don't know what it looks like. I'd be curious to know what your thought, like 10 years from now, what does it look like if we sort of win this battle? I mean, is there kind of like a paradisical, vision where we all agree boys are boys and girls are girls, where there's a rejuvenation of marriage, where big families are possible again? You know what I'm saying? Like,
I think so. I mean, I think what Charlie Kirk did, which is a model every pastor should use, went to campus and said, I'll answer any question you got. You see a transformation. I'm actually the TPUSA faculty advisor. We have 4 campuses, and I'm the advisor for 3 campuses. The 4th one doesn't have a club yet. I'll probably be the advisor of that one because they can't find anyone else to do it. Amazing. Not one professor out of the thousands we have.
Wow.
And that says something, right? But I would go to Charlie Kirk events and just watch, and I've seen a transformation where the students started out, a girl would come up and say, I'm a gender studies student, and I'm pansexual witch, and you're a bigot. And he would disagree and show the absurdity of that position. Yeah. Now, the student who asked it didn't always agree. I mean, they didn't usually say, you're right. But everyone around and everyone on YouTube saw it.
You can see in those clips, I watch all of those. I think my Instagram algorithm is perfect and shows them to me. And you can see people are going like, oh, huh.
Yeah.
Like their face.
But the transformation, though, is the events I've gone to more recently are overwhelmingly, I mean, I would say just from the visual, 70% women, 30% men. And the young women are coming up and saying, hey, how do I make sure family is the most important thing to me, not career? And that's just a huge change.
It's a major paradigm shift from second, third, first wave feminism. Yeah.
Let's. So Evan started to do this when he was asking the question, but just let's for a minute put these cookies on the bottom shelf for our listeners that aren't super familiar with politics and all this kind of stuff. And when we say DEI, they think, well, I thought that was a good thing. Maybe just spell out maybe 2 or 3 of the concepts that would be in this, training module that you disagree with and what you think ought to be taught or thought. Can you kind of spell out a couple of them?
Well, that's really important. I'm glad you asked that, because that's one of the ways this religion manipulates people. That's why I said it really falls into the idea of a cult, because there's healthy religions and unhealthy religions. This is on the unhealthy side.
Interesting.
Because it will use positive terms to present itself to the public. And I mean, that's what every one of these kind of groups does. Hey, do you want enlightenment? Our guy is the first one in human history who ever found enlightenment. You can follow us. And so they offer you some positive thing like that. And diversity, equity, inclusion, those are generally positive words. I mean, you might have questions about each one, but the truth is we live in a pluralistic society. No one doubts that. And we all enjoy it. We all enjoy the fact that there's lots of different kinds of cuisine and culture, lots of kinds of sports, everything like that. So diversity is good. Equity, well, that sounds like justice, and justice is good.
Yeah.
And inclusion, of course we want to include people. A state university is already required to include people.
Yeah.
Way before DEI showed up. A state university cannot say to you, no, you cannot attend because of your skin color or sex.
Isn't the word university a combination of like unity and diversity?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That's why university means all the colleges brought together. Every subject is all studied at the university. So DEI sounds good, and that's how they'll present it to the public. And a parent who's bringing their child to our campus will say, yeah, I think those are good ideas. I'm really glad you're doing that. I'm glad we're finally stopping discrimination in admissions, university admissions. No, hey, that's not been happening. If anything, except for the reverse, right? There's been cases about how Asian students who do too well, they lower the numbers of them who are allowed to go to Harvard. And so those are positive. But the truth of the matter is it's teaching a cultural Marxist philosophy, which is predicated on the idea that history is divided into two groups, the oppressors and the oppressed. This takes it a step further than Marx. Marx just tapped into poverty. This takes it to race and sexual preference, and says that the oppressors, they're not just the rich, they're the white Christian males. And they've oppressed the racial minority who is a sexual minority as well, and just wants to be a woman. Finally, they've been stuck in a man's body and they just want to be a woman, and the white Christian man won't let them. And so that's what you get into. That's the thing that your student is taught. And so for many students, I mean, we know the statistics. The number of students, Christian students, who go to a university and lose their faith is like, what, 60%? I mean, there's some huge number. It's not even close to the number of atheist high schools who go to university and they leave atheism. That's like 2 people on earth that did that. Otherwise, it's the other side. And that's because this is hammered into them. Christians are bigots. Christians are oppressors. Christians marginalize. And that's all they hear in these classes. And they start to realize, I guess I'm
an oppressor,
part of a religion that does those things. And so then the required employee training is to make sure all the employees are on board with that message and they know the messaging to give out.
That's crazy.
That is pretty crazy.
It really is. I mean, that's the thing, is parents need to know this stuff. That's my main hope, is just getting this in front of parents. Like we've seen this in K through 12, a real transformation after the Zoomer year in 2020. And parents are saying, wait a minute, I saw what goes on now in the classroom. Absolutely not. I had a teacher for one of my kids who had a Buddha right behind him while he's teaching on Zoom. And I was like, no, right? You would not have a cross right behind you. What are you doing? And so parents are seeing this stuff and speaking up. And I think we need to push that also into the university level, both for parents and then the students who are adults should be able to say, hey, I'm not paying for this. This is wrong. I'm going to speak up.
So I'm curious, a couple of things. One, how your colleagues have responded to you. I can't believe you still have a job. And
We'll see.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. How do your colleagues respond to you? How's the administration responding? What do the students think? Like, what's the vibe? Are you sort of persona non grata, or are there some champions?
Well, definitely, because again, I have my Substack. I'm very, very direct on it in pointing out this discrimination against Christians. And so I don't use names there. I don't ever say Professor so-and-so did this. Sometimes I'll take a screenshot of the ASU webpage to show this is real. I'm not making this up. And that might include a name on the webpage, but that's already public information.
Sure.
And then I don't talk about the name in my Substack. So I try to keep it focused on arguments.
What is your Substack?
Dr. Owen Anderson. Yeah. Dr. Owen Anderson. And but the truth is that, I'm persona non grata for sure. The people who said we're all about inclusion, we're all about debating ideas, do not want to discuss Anderson conservative Christian stuff.
Yeah.
And so they've said I'm harassing them. Now I don't ever have in-person interactions about this stuff. It's always just if I write a social media post. And so, but the word harassment is the one that ASU HR will pay attention to.
Yeah.
And they'll say, oh, that's actually a problem if he's doing that. They're not going to pay attention to, he's a conservative showing that cultural Marxism is false. And so all they have is my social media. So that is protected by First Amendment, but we'll see how much ASU obeys that versus caves into the pressure from professors. Because I've especially been vocal about something that a number of schools do, including mine at ASU, during faculty meetings. Faculty meetings they're supposed to be about faculty business. How's our enrollment going? What classes are we offering? How's our budget? All that kind of stuff. They make us sit through a Native American land acknowledgement. And it's a very solemn event. They'll start off by saying, now we're going to do our tradition. I'm going to read the Native American land acknowledgement. And you got to sit there. And then at the end of it, some people are usually like, yes, thank you so much for reading.
You got to do it every time?
What?
You have to do it every time you get
together?
Every
time. Yeah, well,
how many times do you have to acknowledge it? I mean, it seems like once is enough.
What I've said is, this gets back to
cover
your
yourself
point
for the
about
year.
It being a religion.
It's like, how many times do I have to apologize to my wife? You know what I mean? Like, once should be enough, you know?
Well, that's a good angle. I've taken that angle, and it gets to your point about this is a religion. This is their Apostles' Creed.
Right.
Yeah.
These are professors who are either they've lived a completely godless life, or they were Christians at one point, and rejected it to now be atheists. And so they still have this yearning, though. I think every human has a yearning for connection to something transcendent, and they can't get that in religion. So they force theirs into our faculty meeting. And so I pointed out what you're saying, which is, wait a minute, you're not in charge of ASU, but you're in charge of your house, which is on those same lands. You can sell it at any point and give the money to whatever tribe you want. This is just an empty gesture. It'd be like saying, I'm sorry to my wife, but not changing anything. She's going to catch on pretty quick, right? Your apologies are empty.
Or it being a legitimate apology, but there being forgiveness. You know? And so on the left, not to make it theological, but I would argue it's a major weakness. There is no grace.
Forgiveness.
There's no forgiveness. There's no mercy. There's law, but no gospel. So there can't
100%.
be.
Yeah.
When a Lutheran talks about law and gospel, we all take a drink.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of skipping ahead, but do you think with the state of education the way it is, or at least the way you've described it, do you think, so I'm a mom of 2 college-age kids.
Okay.
Do you think it's, do you think it's just a waste at this point to even send your kids to college?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and it's actually changed over the 25 years I've been doing this. My answer has changed because it's gone to a point now where I have to say, this is a very dangerous decision you're considering right now. You need to know your child. You're sending them into a place where I've been in faculty meetings where faculty boast about destroying the faith of Christians. They'll never say that to you on the parent tour of their school, but they say that behind your back. And so you got to know your child, and then you got to make sure this is an actual correct approach to what they want to do with life. Because we were all told you got to go to college or you won't be a successful person. And that's just not true anymore. It was probably not true then. It's definitely not true now. There's a lot of other options, but there are some things you got to go to university for. If you want to study like putting a rover on Mars, you're going to have to go to university that has the equipment to do that kind of thing. If you want to study business, there may be other options, or software engineering. There may be other options. So it just depends. And if you were to say, well, what about humanities? What do you want to do? I mean, that's going to be the place where you're told this John Money gender philosophy.
You've mentioned that name twice, and Evan and I know who it is, but if our audience doesn't, can you very briefly?
Yeah, he's a disgraced psychiatrist who came up with this idea that you can, by surgery, change someone from being a man to a woman. And you can, but in his surgery that started this all off with a young boy who had a accident due to a poorly operated circumcision.
Hey guys, Sarah Stone here. Sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is a riveting podcast episode, but Theology by the Pint needs your help to continue providing these podcasts, offering our in-person events, and growing so we can bring thoughtful conversation and the hope of the gospel to a world that's increasingly walking away from church and from faith. Now that we're a 501c3 nonprofit, all donations are tax deductible, so we've crunched the numbers, and if each listener of this episode gave just $1 for each episode you listen to, we'd put a huge dent in our annual budget. So consider giving today. Go to theologybythepint.org/give and click the link to donate. Thanks so much, and now back to our show.
So he said, let's just continue to chop off everything and make him into a girl. And it's a very sad story. You can read about it. It didn't work. It destroyed the family, led to suicides. But what the lesson taken by gender studies professors was, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. And so they promote this idea that there are surgeries that can change your genders, even though there's nothing that can actually change the cells of your body, which are either male or female. And they'll always use a few arguments. Well, what about someone who was born not clear, and say, well, that's a handicap, like you might be born without eyes or something, and it's less than 1% of the people. You're not going to base your entire gender theory on this, right? And if you did look into their genetics, you'd be able to tell, okay, this is XX or XY. So to make everyone else conform to those examples is not how it works.
Yeah. So if people want, you can Google. I mean,
John Money,
but be prepared. Do not do this with young eyes around. The story of John Money and those twins is horrifying.
It's horrible. And if you're sensitive, don't do it. You can just it didn't go well.
Yeah,
that's all.
And that's that.
But that's the whole basis.
The sort of ideology that's being taught at colleges. So you
and
say know your child
as this enlightened thing.
know your child, know the trajectory of what they're kind of wanting to do with their career path. Yep. And
there's a lot of other good options now. I know sometimes they're more expensive, but there's a lot of other private schools that have come up and said, we're going to actually do what universities were supposed to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are things you can do in high school to get college credits, you know, online and yeah.
Oh yeah. There's two things that I have found this isn't, haven't experienced every community college professor, but I found community college professors are generally better teachers and they keep it on the subject compared to university professors. So you can always in high school, you can take community college classes. And then also there's something called a CLEP test, CLEP.
Oh yeah. I took the CLEP test.
Just don't know about. Yeah, they're great. Based on your high school knowledge, you may be able to test out of many of the humanities requirements at the university. You pay a fee for the test, take the test, and you get 3 or 6 credits. Done.
Yeah.
And so you can bypass those university professors altogether.
That's funny. I just did it to avoid early morning classes.
Yeah.
You know, but and you mentioned something in what I read about you beforehand about micro teaching. What is that?
Micro teaching. Usually
maybe
micro
not.
Teaching. Yeah, well, micro teaching is usually the idea of having online classes about your area, and people can then take those, but they're not accredited. And so that's the problem that faces all of us as parents is, well, I want my child to get an accredited degree to get a job. But if what you simply want is an education, there are a ton of great professors who make classes available for free, or universities that do. Hillsdale is probably the best known right now, makes these great classes for free. So the issue is, well, it's not accredited. Yeah, but it depends on the job market. If you go into a job interview and you're being interviewed by someone who has these values and you put on your resume, I've taken all this stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's great. That's actually better. I'm glad you took that instead of the John Money class.
Right. Ligonier, R.C. Sproul's university ministry. I think they have an unaccredited, last time I checked, university. But
exactly.
Like if you put that on your resume, like, and it says university, bachelor's degree, like you don't have to say it's not accredited, and like they wouldn't know. So anyway.
Yeah, they might ask that. But also, I didn't say this, but Sproul got me through atheist philosophy undergrad. Because he had this great series called The Consequences of Ideas. And back then, I had to get, it was cassette tapes.
Yep.
Kind of aged myself, right? So I'm putting the cassette tape in my cassette player, listening to R.C. Sproul go through the history of philosophy. And I just noticed that even if I wasn't a Christian, it provided a level of depth that I wasn't given by atheist professors.
It's interesting. He's a household name for us. My dad studied under him. So we have a lot of those cassette tapes. So let's talk a little bit about, we've been circling this idea of, you've called it leftist ideology. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about woke ideology, this term woke. What does woke mean? And then you mentioned something about woke evangelicals and the woke right. I don't exactly know what those mean. So maybe you can spell out those terms and we can kind of get into that.
Yeah, woke it's a term that initially was a positive.
Yes.
But is now very negative. And
not to the people on that side. They still think it's positive.
Yeah, they might. Yeah, it basically meant I've been awakened to the truth of the matter. I didn't realize this, they would say, but the whole system is structurally racist.
Yeah.
So now I'm woke to that idea. And so the opponents of that view said, wait, you've just been awakened to Marxism, right? This is nothing new. And it's a false philosophy. So you're awakened to a fiction. And so that's where people started saying, oh, that's just woke, to clue in that, okay, this is just that oppressor-oppressed dialectic.
Yeah.
And this dialectic of, I'm not going to take any responsibility for myself. It's everybody else's fault. The system, my teachers, maybe my parents, but they're probably also victims of the system. And so it's this kind of shoving responsibility out away from me. And that's why someone like Ben Carson is so great, because he'll tell you his story growing up. A mom who she couldn't read. He didn't know that when he was a kid. Couldn't read. Grows up in a very poor area. She's a single mom raising 2 boys. And she simply tells him, you're going to read a book at the library every week and write a 1-page report on it. And he has to do that. He said he hated school before that, hated reading. His mom told him to do that. And she would mark it. He thought she could read.
Aww.
He thought she was grading it. He only found out later in life she never learned to read. Now, if anyone could complain, Ben Carson could complain and say my life is terrible and everyone was against me. But instead, he showed what makes America so great, which is that you can take responsibility for your own life. You might not get the exact outcomes you want, but a lot of times they're better than you'd think, better than you even hoped for. I mean, did he think he'd be the world-renowned pediatric neurosurgeon or secretary in the Trump administration? So that's an example where we need to get those kinds of stories in front of people compared to the oppressor. I have no responsibility for my life. I'm just a boat on an ocean being tossed around. So that's what woke means. But there is
before you go into the next ones, I have a clarifying question. So you are a white man. If people are listening to the podcast and not watching, I'm surrounded by white men in here.
How do you know?
Very heteronormative.
But how do you know? You didn't ask Evan or me.
Who said anything about straight?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So when I first started hearing the term woke come on the scene in like TV shows and things like that, it was often people like us, sort of conservative Christian, and I'm also white, learning something about their either privilege or something they may not have known about, say, the Black community or the Latino community. It was sort of educational. And right now I can't think of an example, but the white privilege is what I want to ask you about. Do you think, I mean, we've swung the pendulum so far, but do you think there is any actual white privilege that you've experienced just by virtue of being white? I mean, I feel like I have to ask because people in the audience might be like, well, they might have taken it too far, but there's a little bit of it,
In our day, I don't think so. If anything, my entire career has been under the oppression of people who buy into this. I've had to sit through meetings where white Christian men are insulted.
Yeah.
Called basically
sort of the reverse
stupid.
Then.
And that would never be tolerated. So I've my whole career has been around people who believe that they're very nice and accommodating and inclusive, and yet they speak out of the hatred in their heart about Christian white men. However, there's always a grain of truth. I mean, no cult just tells you a fantasy. There has to be something true that rings true in your ear. And so for Marx, he was right. Rich people like to keep their wealth safe and they don't care about the workers. And they usually have to be forced to have workers' rights and safety in their companies. So that's right. And you say, why can't they get that? Why aren't they able to understand Christian work ethics? And although there's nothing wrong with being rich, our ultimate hope is the glory of God. And we want to use that to help our brothers and sisters, not just accumulate it for myself. And so Marx has that truth. And this also has that truth. Yeah, there has been racism. And we've had to struggle against that. It was unfortunately put into our Constitution. The denomination, the Reformed Presbyterians, spoke up about that at the time. And they said, you can't put slavery into the Constitution. That's wrong.
Yeah.
And that continued that problem to the Civil War. Now, it's important to note that this was all Democrats. Democrats putting slavery into the Constitution, Democrats continuing slavery in the South, Democrats starting the Civil War, Democrats doing Jim Crow laws, Democrats doing redlining, Democrats opposing the Civil Rights Act. So it's like, there's a pattern here, guys. But yeah, that's true. And there's nothing wrong with it, with agreeing to that and saying, that those are horrible. We need to fight against that. But that's what happens is it gets weaponized then. And it goes from the rich need to understand their highest good is not money. They need to care for others. To Christians across the board are the bad guys. And that's when they've stepped over the line. And that's when it does become that kind of unhealthy behavior. And then it gets put into other things, which I would personally find offensive. If I spent my life fighting for civil rights and then a guy who wants to wear a dress says, yeah, we're the same. This is the same issue. I say, no, wait, no, it isn't. I'm talking about unchangeable features of who I am.
Yeah.
Your very philosophy says what you're talking about is changeable.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And I know
so the woke right, real quick about the woke right. The woke right, unfortunately, can do those same things. It allows the radical left to set the battlefield. And I've written posts about this. Don't let that happen. What they say is, yes, identity politics is what matters. And we got to fight for white identity. And you got to say, guys, you're taking the bait.
Yes.
Go back to Christianity, so to speak. And then they'll usually say, yeah, Christianity's always been. No, Christianity is really the only truly universal institution. Every government is only over a people, or a business is over a sector.
Yeah.
Christianity is the truly universal institution for all people to be discipled. And so we don't want to lose that either with the woke right or the woke left by getting into identity politics. We need to just end identity politics.
So the woke right would be what we might call actual white supremacists. I mean, some of them, if you go to the extreme, right?
Yeah, some of those guys, like I wonder if some of that's fake online.
Sure.
You know, like George Soros makes these robots on, these bot accounts to push that stuff so the left can say, see, I told you, because it's so absurd. But I also think, some of those guys that might actually be true. They actually think those things.
Pendulum does like to swing to the opposite side, and people are hurt, and then and then what are woke evangelicals?
Well, I think it's noticed that there's denominations, mainline denominations like Episcopalians, PCUSA, who will have sermons by somebody in drag. You can find those online.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the evangelicals have resisted the mainline lurch. I mean, race to the left, and they've said, no, the Bible's still our authority. Those things are false. But then you'll find that among them, there are those who say, no, we need to do some introspection and agree that there's this structural racism, and accusations have been made along those lines, but they've never been proven to be true. And so the issue is the same thing with the larger institutions like universities, which is if you do make an accusation, you got to prove it in court, whether it's a church court or the civil court. You can't just make an accusation and then act as if you've proven it's true. And so that's really the solution, is the rule of law rather than mob rule, where we all say, yeah, this has been structural racism the whole time. Let's go get them. No, that's not what we do. Take them to court, show your evidence. It could be a criminal case, could be a civil case. Either way, that's what you need to do. So the woke evangelicals, I think that might be applied, I might be wrong, but to guys at the level like Tim Keller, who at that generational level, they might say they're trying to speak to a Manhattan audience. And so you got to speak to their concerns there. But other people point out and say, but it seems like you're actually agreeing with these things.
It is a hard line to find. I want to pivot a little bit because we have a few minutes left, and I want to talk a little bit more about how you react in education. If you are coming from a Christian worldview, how do you sort of hold on to that? And then I also want to just talk a little bit about apologetics. Maybe they're kind of one and the same.
Absolutely,
but how do we equip how do I equip my own children, but how as a Christian community do we equip people to recognize and fight against the kind of groupthink that you're talking about? Like, how should Christians uphold conservative values in liberal university settings or other settings, not just colleges?
Yeah, so I'd like to speak to that, and maybe it overlaps with pastors, but then also address, what do I do in a secular university? Am I going in there and saying, now let's have an altar call? So I like to talk about what do I do in there, but I think the essential thing you need to do, and really my area of study in philosophy, is reason. And you need to teach your children how to think. And I don't mean by that, tell them what to think, but how do you form a sound argument? Mom and dad have been telling you God exists, or the Bible's the inspired word of God. How do you know? And you can start that off pretty young. You can start the basic principles of logic and reasoning quite young. And I know there are Christian curriculums that do that. Unfortunately, most students who come to my classes have never had, K through 12, never had a logic class.
Yep. And
that's just shocking.
I didn't until college. No.
Yeah. I think the student who goes into college knowing already how to spot assumptions in an argument and how to form sound arguments will be pretty safe from the radical ideology. But parents need to do that at home as well as rely on their teachers. You need to show your kids that you care about that, even without directly teaching them. They just see you reading a book and then talking about it at dinner. Oh man, R.C. Sproul made this great point. Let me tell you about this argument he gave. And they just see this is stuff that mom and dad really like. And so I guess it's a good thing to do. So I think that's important. But what I've done professionally is my focus is Romans 1:18 through 21. Not just that God exists. A lot of apologists you'll find will say there's some good arguments that make it reasonable to believe in God. But I've always made the case that it's clear that God exists so that unbelief has no excuse. If all you've got are some good arguments, you have something of an excuse. You can say, well, but I was just a salesman. I wasn't a philosopher, and I didn't have time to sit around thinking about these cosmological arguments with Richard Dawkins. But that's not what Paul says in Romans. The creation around you so clearly reveals his creator to you that no matter what you're doing, you have no excuse for rejecting God. And so I go over arguments against God's existence, and I ask the class, let's look at this. Is this a sound argument or not? And then also for God's existence, is this a sound argument or not? And that's really what philosophy should do. But it's just, I believe that further step is needed in our day. It's always been there, but it's just not emphasized enough in apologetics.
Well, you might be interested in the debate we had a few weeks ago on apologetics. So,
yeah, well, tell me about it real quick.
Well, evidential or classical versus presuppositional.
Okay,
So,
that's where it usually comes up. And the presuppositionalists are known for making these stronger claims. What I studied in my graduate work in religious studies was Benjamin Warfield and Abraham Kuyper, who are both before Van Til.
Right.
And Van Til draws on both of them. And so both of them, Warfield included, make the case that if evidentialism means maybe it's true, it's not enough. Now, there could be evidentialists who say, no, we have a conclusive proof. Okay, that's different. But many evidentialists in those days, and the ones I heard growing up, just say, this is pretty good. It's reasonable.
It's 51% or more. Yeah.
Yeah. So my to beat a dead horse, and I know we're out of time, but my argument is that we live in a post-reason world, so kind of appealing to people. I mean, the best snapshot of this I can think of is like Ben Shapiro's "Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings." Like he thinks that's like a knockdown, drag-out argument. I'm like, bro, we live in a post-reason world.
No, that's true.
Feelings don't care about facts. So it's he's totally, his whole paradigm is totally wrong. That's why I'm in the more presuppositionalist camp. Not only do I think it's theologically and philosophically defensible, but like the times have changed. Like the world, like Van Til was way out in front of where the ultimate godlessness of the world went. So it definitely ties into the DEI conversation, because that's the like fruit of the cultural and worldview shift that has kind of changed from underneath our feet. And so we need adequate tools to fight that fight, which isn't to say that all classical or evidential apologetics is wrong. In fact, it's all correct.
Well, I think you're 100% right. And I think what and I use presuppositionalist arguments because I think the essence of a presuppositional argument is, what are the necessary conditions for X? That's a transcendental argument. And the first one in the history of philosophy is in Aristotle. So the classical guys might not like that. You say, well, actually, Aristotle uses transcendental arguments. He uses it to prove the laws of thought. In other words, you can't prove directly the law of non-contradiction because every proof you give assumes the law of non-contradiction.
That's right.
And so those are really important. So I think you're 100% right, Evan, to say to the current person, here's a bunch of facts. The students no longer care about necessarily like cosmological Big Bang arguments that made William Lane Craig famous in debating well-known new atheists. The new atheists are gone pretty much. It's a guy like
new atheists are old news.
Alex O'Connor, who's going to be, my boys are watching Alex O'Connor and tell me what arguments they would use against him. But I think that there is another sense of reason. So by reason, I don't mean scientific thinking or analytic thinking, but I mean that by which we understand anything at all, how our mind works. And so even the post-reason, the post-modern science person still wants a meaningful life. And they believe what they're doing gives them a meaningful life. That's what makes it a religious cult. I will finally have meaning if society accepts the gender I say I am. And so you can get into that with a presuppositionalist argument, like you're saying, and say, that's not going to give you meaning, and here's the reason why. And people pay attention to that because that's what they're after. They want to make sense of their life.
Yeah, that's a great nugget to end on. This has been really interesting, and we didn't even get into all kinds of stuff about parenting and leadership, but maybe we'll have you on again. But tell people again about your Substack and where they can find you if they want to follow what's going on with you in this lawsuit. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So I do most of my work about that on Substack. So if you just look up Dr. Dr. Owen Anderson, you'll see my picture. You'll see, okay, that's him. And I appreciate it if you subscribe and support it with likes and comments, because that, the algorithms notice that, and that gets this information in front of people. And then I keep that pretty consistently. I have a YouTube channel, also Dr. Owen Anderson. And my most recent interview was with Chris Hansen. You guys know Chris Hansen, right?
I don't. You don't.
To Catch a Predator.
Yeah, the To Catch a Predator guy.
Yeah, Catch a Predator series. Been doing that for 20 plus years. And so he and I had an interview with him, which was really interesting about, do we have free will?
Ooh,
cool. Do these guys have free will? I mean, what's going on? They always show up. They always say the same thing. I knew I shouldn't have done this. Why'd you do with that? So I just had an interview with him that's posted there. And then I'm on X, also Dr. Owen Anderson. So yeah, I'd appreciate it. You know, love to hear from your audience, any comments or questions they have.
Yeah. And for those of you listening, of course, I know we already said it, but we'll say it again. theologybythepint.org is where you can find out everything you need to know about. In fact, we have, I don't know exactly when this will air. This may air after the fact, but you can always go back and listen to it on our YouTube channel. In April, our event is about the war on men. Is there one? Has feminism erased masculinity? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? We're going to be talking about creation and evolution. We're going to be talking about demons, all kinds of interesting things in the coming months. So go on there to check out our upcoming events, support us, join us, hang out with us. And if you have questions for me or Evan, you can also find us on there. And I think that about wraps it up. Thank you so much for joining us. And
really
to our
good
listeners,
to be here. I'm glad to talk with you.
Yeah. Until we see you again, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.